Welcome to Dark Hour Tales. Tonight's tale is The Return of Longtooth. Connor Bailey had been told twice that evening not to go into the woods, although neither warning had been intended specifically for him. The first came from a weathered sign beside the public footpath, informing visitors that the woodland beyond the marked trail was closed after dusk, while the second came from Elliot Price, whose backpack Connor had taken 5 minutes earlier and was now holding above his head. There were 5 of them in the park that evening, all 15 years old and making the most of the final hour before they were expected home. And Connor had spent most of that time irritating Elliot, simply because Elliot always gave him the reaction he wanted. The park itself was large enough to contain several football pitches, a boating pond, and miles of walking paths, but its northern boundary disappeared into an extensive stretch of old woodland that continued far beyond the areas maintained for visitors. During daylight, the trees were popular with dog walkers and cyclists, although after sunset, the lack of lighting transformed the paths into narrow corridors between dense walls of vegetation. Elliot had never liked that part of the park after dark, which was precisely why Connor ran towards it with his backpack and threatened to throw it between the trees unless he came after him. Elliot stopped several meters from the woodland and told Connor that he could keep the bag rather than make him enter the trees in darkness. Connor laughed and asked whether he was frightened of foxes, while another boy told him to give the backpack back before somebody ended up getting into trouble. Instead, Connor swung it once and threw it between 2 trees, where it landed somewhere beyond the reach of the fading evening light. The laughter became noticeably quieter when Elliot still refused to retrieve it, and with several pairs of eyes now watching him, Connor realized that leaving the backpack where he had thrown it would make him look considerably worse than simply collecting it himself. Connor switched on the torch on his phone and entered the woodland while telling his friends that he would be back in less than a minute. The backpack had traveled farther than he expected, forcing him to follow a narrow gap between the trees while sweeping the light across fallen leaves and exposed roots. Within half a minute, the voices behind him had become strangely distant, and when he eventually found the bag beside a fallen branch, he bent to pick it up while already preparing the insult he intended to deliver when he returned. A heavy movement among the leaves behind him made Connor straighten immediately, and when he turned, he expected to find one of his friends attempting to frighten him. His phone illuminated several meters of empty woodland before the beam dissolved among the trees, and although Connor called out that he knew somebody was there, no laughter followed. He remained where he was for several seconds before deciding that he had probably heard a fox or deer moving through the undergrowth, then lifted Elliot's backpack and started towards the park. The vegetation shifted again after he had taken only a few steps, this time somewhere behind and slightly to his left. The sound was heavier than a person brushing against branches and low enough to the ground that Connor briefly wondered whether a large dog had entered the woods. He increased his pace without consciously deciding to do so, and the movement continued at roughly the same speed until Connor stopped and turned around. Whatever had been following him became quiet at almost exactly the same moment. Connor swept the phone light slowly between the trees, searching for anything that might explain the sound. For several seconds, the beam revealed nothing except trunks, wet leaves, and tangled vegetation, until 2 small points of reflected light appeared perhaps 20 meters away. They were unusually low to the ground and farther apart than Connor expected from a fox, while the dark shape surrounding them appeared considerably larger. Before he could focus the light properly, both reflections disappeared behind a tree. The distance back to the park suddenly seemed much greater than it had when Connor entered. He began walking quickly towards his friends' voices, and within seconds, something resumed moving through the undergrowth to his left. Whenever Connor changed direction, the movement seemed to alter with him, and although he could occasionally hear his friends calling in the distance, the trees made it difficult to determine exactly where their voices were coming from. Connor eventually broke into a run, causing the phone light to bounce wildly across branches and tree trunks, while the sound beside him became faster. His foot caught beneath an exposed root before he had traveled more than 20 meters, and he fell heavily enough to lose both Elliot's backpack and his phone. The device landed several feet away with the torch facing back towards him, casting a narrow pool of white light across the leaves while Connor pushed himself onto one elbow and tried to recover his breath. Something entered the edge of the light before he could stand. Connor initially saw only a front leg, unusually long and covered in dark, coarse hair, followed by another limb as a large shape lowered itself and moved towards him. Deep, controlled breathing came from somewhere beyond the reach of the torch, while the light revealed fragments of the animal without ever illuminating enough for Connor to understand what he was seeing. The head gradually entered the beam, revealing dark fur, a long muzzle, and two eyes that reflected almost white when they caught the torch. The creature opened its mouth slightly as it approached, exposing several teeth, although one extended much farther than the others and protruded beyond the lower edge of its jaw. The tooth was pale, narrow, and grotesquely long, and Connor remained on the ground, staring at it, while the creature closed the distance between them. A damp, earthy smell reached him as the animal moved nearer, carrying the scent of wet vegetation mixed with something sour and unpleasant. Connor could hear his own breathing becoming increasingly difficult to control, yet the creature made almost no sound beyond the slow movement of its feet through the leaves. It had come within several meters when one of Connor's friends called his name somewhere behind him, followed by another voice shouting that they were coming to find him. The creature turned towards the approaching voices, and its entire body seemed to become still while it listened. Connor remained where he was because he was too frightened to risk attracting its attention again, but after several seconds the animal moved backwards until the darkness concealed its body. The reflective eyes remained visible for a moment longer before disappearing completely, and Connor finally forced himself to grab Elliot's backpack and run towards his friends without attempting to recover his phone. When Connor emerged from the woodland with mud covering his clothes, his friends initially laughed at his appearance until they saw his face. He struggled to describe what had happened beyond insisting that something enormous had followed him through the trees, and when Elliot asked what kind of animal it had been, Connor could only describe the pale eyes and the tooth. Elliot took his backpack and looked towards the darkness beyond the park before quietly asking whether Connor still thought there was nothing in the woods, and for once Connor could think of nothing sarcastic to say in return. The report reached Joanna Foster 2 days later. Joanna was 42 and had worked as a countryside ranger in the district for 12 years, which was long enough for her to recognize that most reports of unusual animals became considerably less unusual once somebody investigated them properly. Large dogs became wolves when glimpsed in poor light, deer became mysterious predators when frightened walkers saw only part of their bodies, and almost every alleged big cat sighting seemed to involve an animal that conveniently disappeared before anybody obtained a clear photograph. Connor's account would ordinarily have joined the same collection of stories if it had not been the third unusual report from the northern woodland in less than a month. A dog walker had previously described seeing a large dark animal moving parallel to the path, while a cyclist had reported reflective eyes watching him from vegetation beside a trail. Neither witness could identify what they had seen, but both independently described the animal remaining unusually low while moving, and the dog walker had mentioned something pale extending from its mouth. Joanna interviewed Connor with a police officer present and quickly decided that the boy genuinely believed his account. He did not exaggerate what he had seen or claim to understand the animal's appearance, and whenever Joanna asked about details that had remained hidden beyond the phone light, he admitted that he could not answer. What Connor remembered most clearly was the unusually long tooth extending from the creature's mouth, which matched the earlier dog walker's description closely enough that Joanna could no longer dismiss the similarity as easily as she wanted. Her initial theory involved an exotic animal that had either escaped or been deliberately released from private ownership. Illegal collections were uncommon, but not unheard of, and an animal raised in captivity might explain unusual behavior around people. Joanna contacted nearby veterinary practices, neighboring authorities, and police wildlife officers, but nobody had reported an escaped animal capable of matching the descriptions, while the available evidence remained too vague to identify a species. The first useful physical evidence appeared beside a stream almost half a mile from the public park. Several tracks were pressed deeply into the soft ground near the water, although Joanna could not confidently match them to any local animal. Some impressions resembled those of an unusually large canine, while others appeared distorted by an odd distribution of weight, and the stride changed repeatedly over a short distance, as though the animal had altered its posture while moving. Farther along the bank, Joanna found deep scratches across the bark of an old tree, with the highest marks reaching well above her waist and penetrating deeply enough to suggest considerable force. She photographed them before continuing upstream, where she eventually discovered the remains of a deer partly concealed beneath vegetation. Predation itself was not unusual, but the injuries around the neck were wider apart than she expected from a fox or ordinary dog, while one puncture wound extended considerably deeper than the others. Joanna requested assistance from a wildlife specialist and installed several trail cameras throughout the area. For the first 3 nights, the recording showed nothing remarkable beyond deer, foxes, and badgers moving through the woodland after dark. On the 4th morning, however, Joanna returned to a camera position near the stream and found the device lying sideways against the tree. The recording showed ordinary activity until shortly after 2 in the morning, when a fox crossed the frame and disappeared into vegetation. Several minutes later, leaves moved somewhere behind the camera before the image suddenly shook and tipped towards the ground. Whatever disturbed the device had approached from the direction opposite the lens, and fresh tracks in the mud stopped beside the tree without ever passing through the area the camera had been positioned to record. Joanna knew that treating this as deliberate avoidance would require assuming a level of awareness she had no evidence to support, so she repositioned the camera and resisted drawing conclusions. Even so, she began carrying a more powerful torch whenever she worked in the northern woodland and found herself checking behind her more frequently than usual. Her first direct encounter with the unexplained activity occurred a week later, while she was measuring tracks beside a disused service path. Movement among the vegetation behind her initially sounded like a deer, and Joanna continued working until she noticed that the noise had followed her position for several minutes. When she finally returned towards her vehicle, she discovered fresh tracks crossing the boot prints she had made on the way in, with the impressions still dry enough to show that whatever created them had passed behind her only moments earlier. After that afternoon, Joanna stopped treating the investigation as a routine wildlife problem and began searching local records for anything resembling the modern reports. Newspaper archives contained scattered references to livestock being killed during the 1970s, while several articles from the 1950s described residents reporting a large, unidentified animal around the same woodland. None contained enough detail to establish a meaningful connection, and Joanna initially assumed that she was simply finding unrelated incidents because she had started looking for them. An article published in 1926 changed that assumption. The story concerned several livestock attacks and warned children against entering the woodland after dark. But one sentence mentioned that local youngsters had begun referring to the unidentified animal as the long-toothed hound. Joanna searched earlier records and eventually discovered another report published 20 years before that, accompanied by a damaged black and white photograph. The photograph, dated 1906, showed 4 hunters standing beside the body of an enormous dark animal laid across the ground. Damage to the image obscured most of the head and made identification impossible, although the body vaguely resembled an exceptionally large dog. When Joanna enlarged the photograph, however, she noticed a pale shape extending from the damaged mouth, and despite the poor quality of the image, the resemblance to Connor's description was difficult to ignore. The accompanying article claimed that the animal had been killed following a series of livestock attacks and described its species only as unidentified. According to the report, the carcass had been removed for further examination, although Joanna could find no surviving record of what happened afterwards. The possibility that the same individual creature had survived for more than a century was biologically absurd, but the alternatives were hardly satisfying because a surviving population should have produced considerably more evidence, and local folklore could not easily explain why modern witnesses unfamiliar with those stories were describing the same distinctive feature. Joanna printed the photograph and kept it inside her work folder, although she resisted mentioning it publicly because she knew how quickly an investigation could become buried beneath rumors. Her priority remained determining whether a dangerous animal was living close to public walking routes, and that question became considerably more urgent several evenings later when one of the trail cameras transmitted an image shortly after 9 o'clock. The camera overlooked a popular route near the northern boundary, and the photograph showed a couple walking a small dog along the path. Neither person appeared aware that a large dark shape was standing among vegetation approximately 15 meters behind them. The image was too blurred to reveal useful physical detail, but the size of the shape was unmistakable, and Joanna knew that other visitors could still be inside the woodland because the main gates would remain open for almost another hour. She contacted another ranger, requested police assistance, and drove towards the northern access point with the intention of clearing the nearest routes. The couple in the photograph had already left by the time she arrived, and Joanna spent roughly 20 minutes checking paths while calling out to anyone who might still be walking. She encountered nobody, but as she approached an old service route deeper inside the woodland, she heard something large moving among the trees behind her. Joanna directed her torch toward the sound and illuminated dense vegetation without seeing an animal. She continued towards the next junction while listening carefully, and within several seconds, the movement resumed at roughly the same distance behind her. When Joanna changed direction towards the main path, the sound altered with her, and when she stopped walking, the woodland became quiet enough for her to hear the wind moving through the upper branches. She waited for several moments before continuing, only for a branch to snap somewhere ahead of her. Joanna raised the torch and caught a brief glimpse of a large, dark animal crossing the path, perhaps 40 meters away. It remained visible for less than 2 seconds, but the body was considerably larger than any dog she had encountered and moved in a posture that seemed unnaturally low for its size. The sighting immediately disturbed Joanna because the movement she had been hearing only moments earlier had come from behind her. Yet the animal had somehow reached the path ahead without making enough noise for her to follow its route. She radioed the other ranger and reported a possible sighting near the northern service track, although static broke apart most of his response and left her uncertain how far away he was. Joanna began moving towards a maintenance hut roughly half a mile from her position, reasoning that the locked building would provide somewhere safe to wait until assistance arrived. The movement among the trees resumed almost immediately, and after several changes of direction, she could no longer persuade herself that the animal was simply traveling through the same area by coincidence. Whenever Joanna altered her route, the sound shifted accordingly, while every pause she made was followed by an equally abrupt silence from the vegetation. As she increased her pace, the animal began moving faster as well, forcing Joanna to abandon any remaining attempt to observe it and concentrate entirely on reaching the hut. Branches broke behind her with increasing frequency, and when she directed the torch towards her right, 2 pale reflections appeared between the trees, before disappearing several seconds later. Joanna had worked around enough predators to recognize pursuit when she experienced it, and whatever occupied the woodland was now closing the distance between them. The maintenance hut eventually appeared through the trees as a small timber structure beside the service route. Joanna ran towards it while searching her pocket for the key, and as she reached the entrance, the movement behind her became loud enough that she could hear heavy footfalls among the leaves. Her hand slipped while attempting to unlock the door, causing the key to fall onto the ground, and the few seconds required to retrieve it felt considerably longer as vegetation crashed somewhere beyond the reach of her torch. Joanna managed to unlock the door and force herself inside before slamming it behind her, and almost immediately something heavy struck the exterior wall hard enough to shake the shelves. She backed away while radioing the other ranger again, explaining that the animal was directly outside the maintenance hut and warning him not to approach on foot. This time, his response came through clearly enough for Joanna to understand that he was already driving towards her location. Movement traveled slowly along the outside wall while Joanna stood near the center of the hut holding her torch. The building contained little more than a desk, several shelves, tools, and emergency equipment, none of which offered much reassurance against an animal capable of producing the impact she had just felt. When Joanna looked through the nearest window, 2 pale eyes appeared beyond the glass, positioned lower than her own and surrounded by the indistinct outline of a large head. Moonlight briefly revealed part of a long muzzle before the creature shifted, and a single pale tooth extending beneath the mouth caught enough light for Joanna to recognize it immediately. The animal moved away from the window and continued around the building, while a dragging sound against the timber suggested claws or nails lightly testing the exterior rather than simply brushing against it. Joanna spoke quietly into her radio and explained that if the creature remained near the front entrance, she might attempt to leave through the rear maintenance door when the other ranger approached. Within moments of saying this, the scratching outside became silent, and after waiting long enough to hear nothing further, Joanna moved carefully towards the rear of the hut and looked through the small window beside the exit. The reflective eyes were already waiting several meters beyond the rear door. Joanna remained completely still while the animal watched from the vegetation. She could not know whether it had understood the words spoken over the radio, detected her movement inside the hut, or simply anticipated that a trapped person might search for another exit. But each possibility suggested an awareness she found deeply unsettling. The eyes disappeared when she stepped away from the window, and several seconds later, a violent impact struck the front door. The wooden frame creaked under a second impact, forcing Joanna to take a long-handled shovel from the equipment rack while continuing to update the ranger approaching in the vehicle. Another strike damaged the upper hinge, and the force involved made it clear that the door would not withstand repeated attempts. Joanna positioned herself behind the desk with the shovel held in both hands, knowing that the tool would offer little protection if the animal succeeded in entering. A sudden impact against the window fractured the glass and sent small pieces across the floor. The creature struck it again before Joanna could retreat, breaking enough of the pane for its head and part of one shoulder to become visible beyond the frame. For the first time, she saw enough of its body to understand why the witness descriptions had seemed so inconsistent, because its shape suggested something canine without properly matching any dog or wild species she recognized. The limbs appeared unusually long when the animal raised itself, yet its body compressed into a much lower posture while moving, and coarse dark hair obscured much of the structure beneath. The creature opened its mouth as it pushed closer to the broken window, allowing the long pale tooth to catch Joanna's torchlight. She swung the shovel towards the opening, but the animal withdrew quickly enough for the blade to strike the window frame instead. Before Joanna could recover her balance, another violent impact hit the front door and widened the crack around the damaged hinge, leaving part of the frame visibly separated from the wall. Joanna moved behind the desk again and shouted into the radio that the door was beginning to fail. The creature struck once more, forcing the upper hinge farther from the timber, and she could see enough movement through the widening gap to know that another few impacts might allow it inside. With nowhere else to retreat and the rear exit already watched, Joanna tightened both hands around the shovel and prepared to strike at whatever came through first. Headlights suddenly swept between the trees and illuminated the side of the hut as an engine approached rapidly along the service road. The other ranger sounded the vehicle horn repeatedly while driving towards the building, and the creature outside immediately turned away from the damaged door. Joanna heard rapid movement through vegetation as the headlights crossed the woodland, and by the time the ranger vehicle stopped beside the hut, the animal had disappeared deeply enough into the trees that neither person obtained another clear sighting. Only after the immediate danger had passed did Joanna notice how badly her hands were shaking. The front door hung partly away from its frame, broken glass covered the floor beneath the window, and several deep marks scarred the timber outside. She had survived because the other ranger happened to reach the hut before the damaged door failed, and there was nothing about the encounter that suggested the animal had deliberately allowed her to escape. Police and wildlife officers searched the northern woodland the following morning, discovering tracks around the maintenance hut, damaged vegetation along Joanna's route, and enough physical evidence to confirm that a large unidentified animal had been present. The tracks eventually disappeared across stony ground, and despite an extensive search of the surrounding area, nobody found a den, carcass, or other evidence that might reveal where the creature had gone. Authorities temporarily closed the northern section of the woodland and publicly described the situation as a possible escaped exotic animal. Joanna understood the reasoning because there was no responsible alternative explanation to offer, although privately she no longer believed that an escaped captive could account for everything she had seen. She kept the photograph from 1906 inside her work folder and occasionally found herself studying the pale tooth protruding from the damaged image, wondering whether the hunters had actually killed what they believed they had killed, or whether something else had survived beyond the reach of the photograph. Connor Bailey knew nothing about the century-old reports or Joanna's encounter at the maintenance hut. His parents had been told only that authorities were investigating sightings of an unidentified animal, and after several weeks, Connor stopped asking whether anybody had found it. His behavior nevertheless changed noticeably after the night in the woods, because he stopped taking Elliot's belongings, no longer mocked him for being cautious, and refused to go anywhere near the northern boundary whenever the group returned to the park. Connor's parents replaced the phone he had lost, and he assumed the original device remained somewhere beneath the wet leaves where he had fallen. Almost a month after the incident, however, he woke shortly after midnight when a scraping sound came from the wooden fence outside his bedroom. He remained in bed listening until the sound repeated farther along the garden, after which he approached the window and looked outside without switching on his bedroom light. Nothing appeared to be moving, but an object lying in the middle of the lawn caught his attention. Connor recognized the cracked case before he could clearly see the screen, and when he went downstairs and switched on the garden light without opening the back door, there was no doubt that the object was the phone he had dropped deep inside the woodland. Mud covered the casing and the screen remained shattered from the fall, yet somebody or something had carried it more than 2 miles and placed it in the center of his garden. Connor remained behind the locked glass door while trying to decide whether he should wake his parents. A faint movement beyond the garden fence drew his attention before he could call them, and 2 pale reflections appeared briefly in the darkness above the wooden panels. They remained visible long enough for Connor to understand that something on the other side was watching the house, before lowering silently until the darkness concealed them again. Connor did not go outside that night, and when his father discovered the old phone on the lawn the following morning, he assumed somebody from the park had found it and returned it after tracing the owner. Connor allowed him to believe that explanation because describing what he had seen beyond the fence would have required admitting something he did not want to consider, which was that the creature had remembered him, carried the phone out of the woodland, and somehow discovered where he lived. More than 2 miles away, Joanna arrived at the northern woodland shortly after sunrise to inspect another damaged trail camera. The device had not been broken or knocked from the tree, but somebody had rotated it until the lens faced away from the path and directly into an empty section of woodland. When Joanna reviewed the final recording, she watched several minutes of undisturbed trees before the camera began turning slowly on its mount, apparently moved by something standing just outside the frame. The lens eventually stopped facing into the darkness between 2 trees, where the image remained motionless for several seconds. A pale reflection then appeared near the edge of the recording at approximately the height Joanna remembered from the maintenance hut, and although the shape surrounding it remained hidden beyond the camera's limited night vision, she recognized the position immediately. Before the recording ended, a second reflection appeared beside the first, leaving Joanna with the unmistakable impression that whatever had moved the camera had deliberately turned it around so that, for once, it could be the one watching.